1942, at West Point, the United States kept a silent kind of insurance, stacked in the dark like ammunition. Not gold, not oil, silver, industrial silver, held as a strategic reserve for a world at war. For roughly a century, America held the largest stockpile of silver in the history of civilization, over 3 billion ounces, accumulated through coinage policy, treasury purchases, and the long afterglow of empire. That figure isn't folklore. It appears in U.S. government historical reporting and in the long record of Treasury holdings. And today, that number is effectively zero. The strategic reserve is gone, sold, dispersed, consumed, or quietly absorbed by a private market that assumed the state would never again need it. This is the silent crisis. We are entering an era of great power competition and kinetic risk, while simultaneously trying to electrify everything. Cars, grids, weapons, communications. Both transitions are silver-hungry. Missiles and solar panels don't care about ideology. They care about conductivity. So where does a government get silver when it has none? When imports become unreliable? When domestic production cannot cover demand? It gets it the same way governments have always acquired strategic material in wartime. It reallocates it, and then it takes it. You think gold is the prize. Gold is money, but silver is a weapon, and in 10 minutes I'm going to show you the modern paper trail. The defense industrial base language and critical material frameworks that signal the seizure machinery is already being warmed up, not in a dramatic raid, in quiet filings and procurement law. So why does this matter to you? If you're not a miner or a defense contractor, if you're just holding a few tubes of coins or an ETF in a brokerage account. To understand the danger, you have to understand the mechanism, the legal plumbing beneath the polished floor. In the United States, there is a wartime lever that never went away. It simply waits. It is called the Defense Production Act, the DPA, passed in 1950 during the Korean War and amended many times since. It is not a rumor. It is federal statute. At its core, the DPA gives the executive branch authority to prioritize contracts and allocate materials deemed necessary for national defense. That phrase, national defense, is deliberately expansive. It can include military needs, critical infrastructure, and supply chain resilience. This is how dual-use allocation works. Dual-use materials are the ones civilians need, and the state needs more. The same silver that sits in a solar panel also sits in high-reliability electronics, radars, communications gear, and guidance systems. If Apple needs silver for consumer electronics and a weapons contractor needs silver for a missile program, the contractor wins, not because of morality, because under the DPA, priority can be compelled. Civilian demand becomes optional. Defense demand becomes law, now layer in the supply constraint. The United States consumes far more silver than it mines. The exact tonnage varies year to year, but the direction is consistent. The U.S. is structurally dependent on imports, Mexico, Peru, and other producing nations, either directly or through refined supply chains. When a country depends on imports for a strategic input, it is living on borrowed oxygen. It breathes easily, until the corridor fills with smoke. Now the pinch point. If imports stop, war, embargo, export ban, shipping disruption, currency conflict, the state does not politely wait for markets to self-correct. It invokes allocation. It redirects supply. It defines new priorities. And in that moment, your silver stops being a private commodity and becomes, in practice, a domestic stockpile. Your ETF becomes a warehouse the government can reach with a phone call. Your vaulted bullion becomes available inventory in a crisis memo. This is what eminent domain looks like in materials form, not land seized for a highway, metal seized for a supply chain. Look at how fast language changes under stress. 1 year it is investment demand. The next year it is strategic vulnerability. When did your asset become a national security input? Now we need the ghost. The historical precedent almost nobody talks about. Most people know the gold story. 1933, Executive Order 6102. The state demanded surrender of gold coin and bullion under threat of penalty. The message was clear. In a monetary emergency, private ownership is negotiable, but far fewer people know the silver story. In 1934, Executive Order 6814 required the delivery of silver to the United States for coinage. The language is blunt, bureaucratic, and devastating. Silver, like gold, was treated as a strategic lever of policy, not a personal possession beyond reach. This matters because it proves a psychological point. The line between your metal and their metal is not moral, it is statutory, and statutes can be activated when fear is high enough. But the reason this time is different is darker. In 1934, the seizure motive was monetary. The government wanted to influence the money supply and the price of silver, which was still entangled with coinage and monetary policy. They paid a fixed price. You were compensated on paper while the state restructured the monetary system around you. In the modern era, the motive is industrial, not to mint coin, to manufacture systems. Guidance electronics, secure communications, power distribution, solar panels. An industrial seizure is less polite because it claims urgency. Now consider the second difference: price control. If the government compels delivery during an emergency, it can pay fair market value. That sounds reasonable until you realize who can define the market and how easily that market can be capped. A price ceiling is a lid on a boiling pot. It doesn't cool the water, it traps pressure. It pushes trade into shadows. The official price becomes theater, while the real price migrates to wherever the metal actually changes hands. If a government seized precious metals once to defend its monetary system, why would it hesitate to seize them again to defend its weapons and energy systems? Now we move from precedent to trigger, the catalyst event that makes the lever irresistible. It begins with resource nationalism, the instinct of producing nations to keep resources at home when the world becomes unstable. This is not rare. It is cyclical. Countries that control a bottleneck eventually try to monetize it, weaponize it, or both. Silver production is geographically concentrated. Mexico and Peru are major sources. China and Russia are significant players in the broader metals ecosystem. When supply chains fray, geography becomes fate. Now imagine a realistic scenario. Mexico, frequently cited as the world's leading silver producer, faces internal stress, political pressure, cartel disruption, or strategic bargaining. It enacts an export restriction, a ban, a quota, or a tariff so punishing that exports slow to trickle. This does not need to be permanent. It only needs to last long enough to break just-in-time inventories. Just-in-time is a modern prayer. We keep little inventory because the world is supposed to remain predictable. It is efficient in peace. It is suicidal in crisis. If a key supplier tightens exports, industrial users in the U.S. begin to compete not on price but on availability. The supply chain doesn't gradually adjust. It snaps. 90 days is not a prophecy. It's a logistics reality. Manufacturers run lean. Defense programs often require specific grades, specific forms, specific suppliers. When those streams halt, the calendar becomes a weapon. And then comes consummation, the legal declaration that changes the entire game. A national emergency for critical minerals or defense supply chains. An invocation of the DPA for mining, refining, or materials allocation. A directive that prioritizes defense and critical infrastructure over consumer and investment demand. At the same moment, the paper market finds its own escape hatch. COMEX contracts, ETFs, custodial structures. They are designed with contingencies. Under stress, delivery becomes negotiable. Force majeure clauses exist for a reason: to preserve the institution when reality becomes inconvenient. The paper market can settle in cash, dollars instead of metal, a check instead of a bar. So you receive $30 an ounce because the screen said 30. While the street price where actual silver changes hands prints 150, not because the screen is wrong, but because the screen is pricing paper, and paper is what can be created when metal is scarce. This is the nightmare of the investor who thought they owned silver exposure. In an emergency, exposure becomes liquidation. Ownership becomes a payout. Look at how quickly strategic necessity overrides normal property rights in wartime. If copper scarcity justified using silver then, what will semiconductor scarcity justify now? Now the practical question: how do you own silver without putting a bright red target on it? Because the risk profile has changed. Silver is no longer just volatile, It is increasingly strategic, and strategic assets carry a different hazard. Confiscation, forced sale, forced allocation, or paper substitution. So the objective is not just profit, it is possession, under the right classification, in the right place, with the fewest easy levers attached. The first strategy is what I'll call the numismatic loophole, not because it's cute, because it's historical. Even in past executive actions, exemptions existed. In EO 6814, rare and unusual coins were treated differently. The state can justify taking bullion by calling it a strategic raw material. It has a harder time justifying taking collectibles, historically significant pieces, or legal tender with numismatic characteristics. This doesn't mean numismatics are risk-free. It means classification is a form of camouflage. Second, avoid the easiest honeypot, ETFs and pooled vehicles. An ETF is convenient. That is exactly why it is vulnerable. It concentrates metal, custody, and ownership records into a small number of entities that can be pressured, regulated, or compelled. One call to a custodian can freeze creation and redemption. One directive can redirect inventory. Third, consider junk silver. Pre-1964 U.S. 90% silver coinage. Dimes, quarters, half dollars, not because it is glamorous, because it is small, widely recognized, and historically treated as money. It is fractional. It is transactional. It can move quietly. And it often sits below the radar of the strategic raw bullion narrative because it is legal tender coinage from a prior monetary era. Fourth, if you vault, choose the battlefield carefully. A bank's safe deposit box is not private. It is private until it is. It sits inside the regulated banking perimeter. In a crisis, that perimeter becomes a control zone. Boxes can be sealed. Access can be restricted. And policy can move faster than your ability to react. A private, non-bank vault reduces some of that risk. It is not invisible, but it is outside the easiest choke points. The goal is not secrecy for its own sake. The goal is reducing single points of failure. And now the line most people don't want to hear. The time to structure ownership is before the emergency, not after. When the public finally discovers silver is strategic, it will already be scarce. Dealers will go out of stock, premiums will explode, shipping will delay, paper will substitute for metal. You buy insurance before the smoke, not after the siren. If tomorrow you were told silver is now allocated for defense production and retail bullion is restricted, would your current form of ownership survive that announcement? Now the conclusion, stated cleanly. Silver is no longer just a precious metal. It is increasingly a strategic critical mineral. That changes the risk from price volatility to political risk. And political risk is the kind that arrives overnight, wrapped in patriotic language. The seizure may not look like soldiers at your door. It may look like an email from a broker about changed terms. It may look like temporary restrictions. It may look like cash settlement. It may look like a capped price that is legal on paper and absurd in reality. In this world, possession is not a slogan. It's a legal position. If you want to track this in real time, watch three things. First, DPA invocations tied to mining, refining, and critical materials. Watch not just the DPA itself, but how often it's used and for what categories. Each invocation normalizes the lever. Second, export bans and mining law changes in key producing countries, especially Mexico. Resource nationalism doesn't need a war. It only needs leverage. Third, signs of strategic stockpile refilling or large, opaque government-linked purchases. If the U.S. begins accumulating silver again, price can move violently, and policy can harden immediately after. First they buy, then they ration, then they control. They need it for the missiles, you need it for your freedom. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Make sure you are the one holding it. I'll see you in the next file.